The first sound was the tear of paper. Not the clean rip of a boarding pass at a kiosk, but the slow, deliberate sound of paper being folded, creased, and pulled apart with intent, right there in the quiet front cabin of the aircraft. The man holding the ticket did it calmly, almost politely, as if he were proving a point no one had asked him to make. "This can't be right," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, but smooth enough to sound reasonable. "These seats are mine." The woman standing in the aisle did not move. She was in her early 60s, grey threaded carefully through dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck. Her hands were still resting on the armrests of seat 1A and 1B, as if the plane itself had grown around her. Her husband remained seated beside her, shoulders square, back straight, eyes lifted but unreadable. The flight attendant froze. The passengers nearby stopped breathing. Somewhere deeper in the cabin, a coffee cup rattled as turbulence shook the aircraft on the ground. James Whittaker had lived long enough to recognize this moment for what it was. Not an argument, not a misunderstanding. A decision already made by someone else, waiting only for permission to become real. The man in the aisle, Richard Coleman, glanced down at the shredded paper in his hand, then up at the crew member approaching from the galley. He smiled. It was the smile of a man used to rooms adjusting around him. "These seats are usually reserved for our priority members," the flight attendant said, her voice thin with strain. Her eyes flicked to James's hands, to Ruth's sensible shoes, to the quiet way they occupied space. "Let's just step back for a moment and figure this out." Ruth Whittaker inhaled slowly. The air smelled of leather, disinfectant, and the faint citrus of pre-flight wipes. She had practiced that breath for decades. In courtrooms, in hospital rooms, in moments when speaking too fast would cost more than silence ever could. "We did figure it out," she said evenly. "We booked these seats. We paid for them. We boarded with valid passes." Her voice did not rise. It did not shake. That seemed to irritate Richard more than anger would have. He laughed, short and sharp. "Ma'am, I fly this route every week. Everyone knows me. I sit here. Always." He gestured vaguely towards the cockpit, as if the captain himself were part of his social circle. "This airline takes care of people who matter." The words hung there. Matter. James felt Ruth's knee brush his. A small signal. Stay seated. Stay calm. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He looked around the cabin, the way he always did when a situation shifted. He noticed the older couple across the aisle, hands clasped tightly together. The man in the second row who had stopped scrolling and was watching now, jaw set. The faint glow of a phone screen being lowered, not yet recording, but ready. Time slowed. It always did, right before something broke. James's mind drifted, uninvited, to another airplane decades earlier. Economy class. A crying baby. A woman insisting he was in the wrong row despite the ticket in his hand. He had been younger then, faster to speak, slower to understand that volume never equaled power. Now, power was quieter, heavier. It sat in his chest like a held breath. "Sir," the flight attendant said to James, her posture stiffening, "if there's been a mix-up, we do have other seats available further back. We can offer compensation." Richard exhaled loudly, satisfied. "That sounds reasonable. I've got a meeting right after landing. I don't have time for this." Ruth turned her head slowly and looked at the attendant, not with anger, with focus. "Are you asking us to give up our seats for him?" she asked. "Or are you telling us to?" The attendant hesitated. In that pause lived 1,000 unspoken calculations. Delay reports, supervisor calls, complaints. The invisible weight of past decisions that had taught her which conflicts ended careers and which merely bruised egos. I'm asking you to cooperate, she said finally. James closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to feel the ache behind them. Just long enough to remember his father's voice years ago, telling him that cooperation was not the same as surrender, but sometimes looked exactly like it. He opened his eyes. No, he said. The word landed harder than shouting ever could. Richard straightened. Excuse me? No, James repeated, calm, firm. We're not moving. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closer, the lights brighter. The flight attendant glanced toward the cockpit, then back at them. Her smile was gone. Sir, if you refuse a crew request, we may have to escalate this. Ruth felt her pulse quicken. Not fear, something older. A memory of being told, again and again, to be reasonable in moments that were anything but. Escalate how? She asked. Before the attendant could answer, another voice cut in. Male, older, edged with irritation. What seems to be the problem? The captain had stepped into the aisle. Silver hair, lines carved deep around his mouth. A man who had spent decades managing weather, machines, and people who believed urgency gave them authority. Richard turned immediately. Captain, thank God. There's been a mistake. These folks are in my seats. The captain looked at James and Ruth. His gaze lingered just a beat longer than necessary. Then he looked back at the attendant. We're already running behind, he said. I don't want this turning into a scene. James met his eyes. It's already a scene, he said quietly. We just didn't start it. The captain's jaw tightened. He had heard that tone before, the tone of someone who would not bend easily. Sir, the captain said, lowering his voice, sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. Ruth felt the familiar burn rise in her chest. The simplicity he was talking about had a cost, and she had paid it too many times already in her life. The simplest solution, she said, would be for him to sit in the seat he paid for. Richard scoffed. Unbelievable. From the back of the cabin, a woman's voice spoke up. They're right. Soft but clear. I watched them board. The captain glanced over his shoulder. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Witnesses complicated things. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down now, not just on them, but on everyone watching. He could feel Ruth's tension, coiled and controlled beside him. He could feel the eyes, the judgment, the waiting. This was the part people never understood, the silence before the choice, the way it echoed. James thought of the call he had taken earlier that morning, standing by the window at home, watching the sun hit the frost on the lawn. The words, merger finalized, still ringing in his ear, the signature that had changed more than anyone in this cabin could possibly imagine. He had told Ruth they would talk about it after the trip. He had meant it. The captain cleared his throat. Sir, Ma'am, he said, decision settling into his posture. I'm going to ask you to gather your things and step off the aircraft so we can resolve this at the gate. Ruth's breath caught. Just slightly. James did not move. Around them, the cabin seemed to lean forward, waiting for the sound of compliance, or resistance, or something in between. What came next would not be loud, but it would be irreversible. The jet bridge felt colder than it should have, the kind of institutional chill that clung to the bones and made everything sound sharper. Shoes scuffed. A radio crackled. The hollow thud of the aircraft door closing behind them landed like a verdict. James Whittaker walked beside Ruth without touching her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew she needed the space to hold herself upright. Her chin was high, her shoulders squared. The posture of a woman who had been told, more than once in her life, to accept an injustice quietly, and had learned instead how to endure it without shrinking. The ground supervisor met them halfway down the bridge, breathless, clipboard clutched to his chest. He was younger than the captain, late 30s, maybe early 40s. A man who still believed procedures could shield him from consequences. "We'll get this sorted out," he said quickly, eyes flicking past them toward the plane. "If you'll just come with me." Sorted out. Ruth almost smiled at the phrase. It was the kind of language people used when they wanted time, not truth. They were guided into a glass-walled office near the gate, the kind meant for minor inconveniences and delayed luggage. The door shut with a soft click that somehow felt louder than the arguments on the aircraft. Outside, passengers hurried past, rolling bags, checking phones, lives in motion. Inside, the supervisor sat. Another employee hovered by the door. A security officer leaned against the wall, arms crossed, expression neutral but alert. James took in the room. The laminated evacuation map on the wall, the faint smell of burnt coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights. He registered it all the way he always did, cataloguing details, building a quiet record. Ruth sat beside him. Her hands were folded in her lap. They were trembling now, just a little. "We understand there was a disagreement on board," the supervisor began, smoothing the edge of his clipboard. "Mr. Coleman is a long-standing customer, a valued one. The captain felt the situation was escalating." "It escalated when we were told to leave seats we paid for," Ruth said. Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it now. "We did nothing to warrant removal." The supervisor nodded, as if that were reasonable, as if acknowledging her words cost him nothing. "Of course, and we apologize for any distress. We can rebook you on a later flight, first class, with compensation." James watched the security officer's eyes shift, watched the slight relaxation in his stance now that the word compensation had been spoken. Money often smoothed things, often enough to make people believe the damage was contained. "How much?" James asked. The supervisor hesitated. "We can offer travel credit and a refund of the fare difference." James nodded slowly. He felt the familiar pull toward calculation, toward solving. He pushed it aside. "We don't want credit," Ruth said. "We want accountability." The supervisor blinked. That wasn't on his script. "Sir, Ma'am," he said carefully, "these situations are complex. There are policies, safety considerations." James leaned forward, just an inch, enough to change the air in the room. "There was nothing unsafe about us sitting quietly in our assigned seats," he said. "What was unsafe was deciding that another man's comfort mattered more than our rights." The security officer shifted again. His jaw tightened. He had been listening. Outside the glass wall, a woman slowed her walk, curious. A man paused near the door, pretending to check his phone. The story was already leaking into the terminal. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Let me get my manager." He left the room too quickly, relief written across his back. The hovering employee followed. The door clicked shut again. Silence settled. Thick, pressurized. Ruth exhaled shakily. The composure cracked, just enough to let something raw show through. "I hate that it still feels like this," she said softly. "After all these years." James reached for her hand now, held it. Her skin was cool. "I know," he said. He meant more than she could hear in those two words. The security officer straightened. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I didn't think you should have been removed." Ruth looked up at him, met his eyes. "Then why did you stand there and let it happen?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was tired. He swallowed. "Because when the captain gives an order, it becomes my problem if I don't enforce it." James nodded. He understood that calculus. He had made versions of it himself long ago, before he learned what those compromises cost. Footsteps returned. He heard them before the door opened. He always did. The manager entered with practiced calm, hair immaculate, voice smooth. She apologized. She acknowledged. She offered more. Hotel vouchers, meal vouchers, a future upgrade guarantee. The words stacked up like sandbags, meant to hold back a flood. James listened without interrupting. Ruth listened until she couldn't. "This isn't about comfort," she said. "It's about dignity." The manager smiled tightly. "Of course." James felt something settle in him then, a decision, fully formed. He stood. "I need to make a call," he said. The manager gestured vaguely toward the door. "Of course." James stepped into the terminal, the noise rushing back around him. Announcements echoed. Wheels clacked against tile. Somewhere, a child laughed. He took out his phone. The name at the top of his contacts list wasn't labeled with the title, just a first name. Daniel. The call connected on the second ring. "Already boarding?" Daniel asked. "No," James said. He watched a plane taxi past the window, sunlight glinting off its fuselage. Something happened. There was a pause, the kind that meant attention. James spoke calmly, precisely. He did not embellish. He did not vent. He described the facts, the removal, the justification, the names. When he finished, Daniel exhaled slowly. "Do you want me to start documenting?" "Yes," James said. "And I want compliance looped in. This isn't a complaint. It's a trigger." Another pause. Longer this time. "That clause," Daniel said carefully. "The one we discussed." "I know," James said. "I'm not asking for action. Not yet. I'm asking for readiness." "Understood." James ended the call and stood still for a moment, letting the noise wash over him. His reflection stared back from the glass. Older, tired, unmistakably resolved. As they walked away, Ruth glanced back once at the aircraft through the glass. She saw the first-class window, the seat, someone else settling into it. Her throat tightened. James squeezed her hand. "Look forward," he said gently. She did. Neither of them saw the small group forming near the gate, passengers murmuring, phones raised. Neither of them heard the first message hit the internal system, flagged for review, marked unusual. They moved through the terminal together, two figures receding into the flow of the airport, carrying with them a moment that would not stay contained. Behind them, the plane prepared for departure. Ahead of them, consequences were beginning to take shape. The later flight left at dusk, the sky bruised purple and orange as the plane lifted off the runway. James watched the ground fall away, the geometry of the airport shrinking into abstraction, and felt the tension in his chest loosen only slightly. The wrongness of the afternoon clung to him, like smoke that wouldn't wash out. Ruth sat by the window, hands folded around a paper cup of water. She hadn't asked for wine. She hadn't asked for anything. Her reflection floated faintly in the glass, superimposed over the fading light. "They keep saying they're sorry," she said quietly. "But they don't say for what." James nodded. "Because naming it makes it real." She turned to him then. Her eyes were tired, but sharp. "You meant what you said back there?" "Yes." "You're not just documenting." "No." The cabin hummed around them. A baby fussed 2 rows back. Someone laughed softly. Ordinary life continuing, indifferent. Ruth looked away again. "I don't want this to turn into something ugly." James leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his voice was low. It already was. What happens next is about shape, not heat. The flight was short. They landed, collected their bags, drove a rental car south along a darkening highway lined with palms and blinking motel signs. By the time they reached the small hotel near the beach, Ruth's composure had thinned. The room smelled faintly of bleach and ocean air. She set her purse down carefully, as if a sudden movement might break something. James watched her sit on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumping for the first time that day. "They saw us," she said, "and they decided." He sat beside her. "I know." She pressed her palms into her eyes. "I thought I was past this." "So did I." Silence stretched. Outside, waves broke rhythmically, indifferent and eternal. James's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at it, then turned it face down. "Tomorrow," he said. "We rest tonight." Ruth nodded, but sleep came in fragments. She woke once, heart racing, the image of the captain's face looming in her mind. James lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling fan slicing the dark, counting its rotations like breaths. Morning brought light and resolve. By the time Ruth returned from a walk along the shore, shoes in hand, the sun was high, and James was already on the phone. His voice was calm, precise, the way it got when he moved from feeling to structure. "Yes," he said. "I want a full incident timeline, from gate scan to removal. Pull audio if it exists. I know it's messy." A pause. Then, "No, not public. Internal review only, for now." He ended the call as Ruth entered. She studied his face. "It started." He nodded, quietly. They spent the day the way they had planned months ago. Lunch at a small place near the water, a slow walk along the pier, tourists in bright shirts, retirees with folding chairs. Life uncomplicated on the surface, but beneath it, messages were moving. At the airline's regional office, an operations manager named Linda Harris stared at her screen, brow furrowed. The overnight report flagged an unusual number of complaints tied to a single flight. Not volume, consistency. Different passengers, similar language, removal, priority override, uncomfortable optics. She forwarded it upward with a short note: potential escalation. At headquarters, the message landed in an inbox already heavy with cost reports and staffing spreadsheets. It sat there for nearly an hour before someone opened it. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman stood in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, irritation simmering. "I don't care what they say," he snapped. "I fly with them all the time. They know who I am." On the other end, his contact made a placating sound. "I'm just saying, this time it's louder." "Louder than what?" "Than usual." Richard scoffed. "They'll forget about it by next week." He poured himself coffee, sloshing it onto the counter, wiped it up with a paper towel. Outside, his immaculate lawn glowed in the morning sun. Back at the beach, Ruth sat beneath an umbrella, watching James skim stones across the water. Each skipped once, twice, then sank. "You're thinking too much," she said. He smiled faintly. "Occupational hazard." She studied him. "When did you decide?" He paused. "When the captain wouldn't look me in the eye." She nodded. That made sense. That afternoon, James took another call. Shorter, more guarded. "Yes," he said. "I'm aware of the redundancy clauses. That's why this is a review, not an action. For now." Another pause. His jaw tightened. "Document everything, especially the language." He ended the call and stared out at the water. Ruth joined him. "They're nervous," she said. "They should be," he replied. "Not because of me, because of themselves." At the airline, the review widened. Legal was looped in. Compliance asked questions no one liked. Why was a single customer allowed to override seating without a documented upgrade? Why was security used instead of mediation? Why the captain chose removal over delay? Answers came slowly, carefully worded, incomplete. A junior analyst working late pulled passenger manifest data and noticed something odd. The couple removed. Names familiar. He frowned, typed them into another system. His eyebrows rose. He forwarded the information up the chain without commentary. The CEO read it just before dinner. He stared at the screen, then at the window overlooking the city. The name tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. He called his assistant. "Set up a call with legal tomorrow morning. Early." "Yes, sir." That evening, Ruth and James sat on the balcony, listening to the surf. The horizon was a dark line now, stars emerging one by one. "I don't want them ruined," Ruth said softly. "I want them changed." James looked at her. Really looked. Change requires cost. She met his gaze. Not destruction. He nodded slowly. Agreed. His phone buzzed again. A text this time. One line. "They know who you are." James exhaled. Not relief. Recognition. He typed back. "Then they can decide what to do with that knowledge." The night deepened. Somewhere far away, in offices and data centers and conference rooms, people were beginning to connect dots they wished had remained separate. On the beach, the waves kept coming, steady and impartial, as consequences gathered their shape. By Monday morning, the word review had been replaced by investigation. It happened quietly, the way serious things usually did. A calendar invite sent before sunrise. A subject line stripped of adjectives. Internal compliance briefing. Mandatory attendance. James Whittaker sat at the small desk in the hotel room, jacket folded neatly beside him, coffee cooling untouched. The ocean was loud today, waves hitting the shore with a steady insistence that felt almost deliberate. Ruth stood behind him, hands resting on the back of his chair, reading over his shoulder as the first secure call connected. Videos appeared in neat rectangles, some familiar, some new, all careful. Daniel was there, eyes sharp behind thin frames. So was a woman from compliance James had never met in person, her background a wall of legal books arranged with aggressive precision. A younger man from operations adjusted his headset, already sweating. "No decisions today," Daniel began. "This is fact-finding only." James inclined his head. Understood. The compliance officer took over, voice even, practiced. She walked them through the timeline. Boarding, seat dispute, priority override request, captain notification, security involvement, passenger removal. Each step laid out without commentary, like evidence on a stainless steel table. "When did the override occur?" she asked. The operations manager cleared his throat. 8 minutes after boarding completed. "And was there a documented upgrade processed through the system?" A pause. Too long. "No," he admitted. "It appears the request was handled verbally." Ruth felt James's shoulder tense beneath her hands. She leaned in slightly, a silent reminder. Stay steady. "So a non-documented preference," the compliance officer said, "superseded a paid, confirmed seat assignment." "Yes." "And that preference belonged to whom?" Another pause. "Mr. Richard Coleman." The name landed with weight now. Not authority, liability. Across the call, someone shifted uncomfortably. James watched faces change, almost imperceptibly, as the story reframed itself. Not a customer service issue, a process failure, a risk. The compliance officer continued. "Were alternative de-escalation measures attempted?" "No." "Why not?" The captain's representative spoke up, defensive. "We were behind schedule. The gate staff indicated the passenger was becoming uncooperative." James spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, but it carried. Uncooperative means refusing to surrender something that is rightfully yours. Silence followed. Not offended, acknowledging. Ruth watched the younger operations manager glance down, cheeks coloring. He had been the one to mark the incident routine in the system before the complaints came in. The compliance officer nodded once. That distinction matters. By mid-morning, the call ended without conclusions. That, too, was telling. James closed the laptop and leaned back. For the first time since the plane, the tightness in his chest shifted. Not gone. Redirected. Ruth moved around him and sat on the edge of the desk. "They're scared," she said. "Yes, good scared or defensive scared?" He considered. "Both." At Airline headquarters, the mood had turned brittle. The CEO stood at the head of a long glass table, hands braced against it, as legal counsel laid out exposure scenarios. Regulatory scrutiny, civil liability, reputational damage. "This is not just optics," legal said. "It's pattern risk. If this becomes an example, plaintiffs will follow." The CEO closed his eyes briefly. He had built his career on efficiency, on trimming excess, and trusting that frontline staff would make decisions aligned with company interests. He was beginning to understand how often interest had been confused with convenience. "Who authorized the override?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Across town, Richard Coleman sat in his office, scrolling through his phone. Mentions, tags. The story had started leaking. Not his name yet, just the incident. A couple removed, first class, priority customer. He frowned. This was not how it usually went. He dialed a number, left a message, dialed another, straight to voicemail. By lunchtime, the airline released a short statement, carefully worded, expressing regret, promising review. The kind of thing designed to calm markets, not people. Ruth read it on her phone and handed it to James. "They still won't name it." "They will," he said, "when they realize silence costs more." That afternoon, a call came from an unfamiliar number. James let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Whitaker," a voice said, overly smooth. "This is corporate relations. We'd like to speak with you directly." James glanced at Ruth. She nodded. "You are?" he said. There was a beat of surprise, then recovery. "We want to make this right." James's tone did not change. "Define right." Compensation was offered. Significant. Private apology. Discretion. Ruth listened, jaw tightening. "This isn't about being made whole," James said. "It's about acknowledging what happened and why." Another pause, longer this time. "We're not prepared to characterize intent," the voice said carefully. James ended the call without responding. At the hotel, Ruth finally let herself sit heavily on the bed. The composure she had worn like armor all weekend slipped. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with heat. "They're still trying to buy quiet," she said. James sat beside her, took her hands. "And we're still refusing." Her voice broke then. "Just once. I'm tired of being the test case." He pulled her into it, holding her while the sound of the ocean pressed in through the open door. He felt the tremor in her shoulders, the years beneath it. "I know," he said. "That's why this stops here." The next morning, the analyst who had flagged the names received a quiet thank you from compliance and a request for further digging. He uncovered past complaints tied to the same priority customer. Patterns, small ones, easy to dismiss individually. Together, they formed something else. By Wednesday, the board was briefed. The CEO sat alone afterward, staring at the city below his office window. The call with corporate relations replayed in his head. The refusal, the calm certainty. He picked up the phone again, hesitated, then dialed a different number. "Find out everything you can about James Whittaker," he said, quietly. That evening, Ruth and James walked to the beach again. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows. "You okay?" James asked. She nodded. "I will be." She stopped walking, turned to him. "You're sure about this?" "Yes." "This changes things." He looked at her, the woman he had built a life with, the one who knew every cost. "Some things need changing." Her hand tightened around his. "Then finish it." As darkness settled, a notification pinged on James's phone. An internal memo forwarded by Daniel. Subject line, "Revised. Formal investigation initiated." James read it once, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Behind them, the shoreline erased their footprints as quickly as they were made. But the path ahead was now fixed. Not loud, not fast. Inevitable. The call came just after sunrise, the kind of hour when bad news prefers to arrive because defenses are still down. James was already awake, sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the maintenance crew rake the beach smooth for tourists who would never know what had been erased overnight. His phone vibrated softly against the table. Daniel's name lit the screen. "They found more," Daniel said without preamble. His voice was low, tight. "Not just patterns, procedures." James closed his eyes. He could hear Ruth moving inside the room, the faint sound of running water as she brushed her teeth. Normal life insisting on its place. "Walk me through it," James said. "The priority override isn't new," Daniel continued. "It's informal, undocumented, but it's been used before. Gate supervisors have discretion. No paper trail unless someone complains loudly enough. Even then, it's usually smoothed over." James let that settle. A system that trained people to erase their own tracks. "And the captain?" James asked. "Deferred to ground. Standard practice, but it means responsibility gets passed like a hot object no one wants to hold." James exhaled slowly. "And Coleman?" A pause. "He's been flagged internally before. Aggressive behavior, threats of escalation. He knows which levers to pull." James ended the call as Ruth stepped onto the balcony, hair still damp, wrapped in a light robe. She read his face instantly. "It's worse," she said. "It's older," he replied, "which makes it worse." They ate breakfast in near silence, the clink of cutlery loud against their thoughts. Around them, other guests talked about weather and grandchildren and tea times. The ordinary comforts of a life that assumed fairness, until proven otherwise. Back at Airline headquarters, the CEO sat through another briefing, this one heavier. Compliance spoke, legal spoke, public relations spoke last, and spoke carefully. "If this becomes public," PR said, "we lose control of the narrative." The CEO stared at the table. "We already have." He thought of the man whose name now sat at the center of the storm, James Whittaker. The research had come back fast and unsettling. Not loud, not flashy, deeply embedded. The kind of power that didn't announce itself until it moved. He felt something cold trace his spine. Across town, Richard Coleman paced his living room, phone pressed to his ear, voice rising. "They're overreacting," he snapped. "I didn't do anything wrong." The person on the other end said nothing for a moment. When they spoke, their tone had changed. "Richard," they said, "they're not calling about customer service anymore." His pacing slowed. "What does that mean?" "It means they're looking at process and culture." He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "They won't touch me." Another pause. "They already are." The call ended. Richard stared at his phone, then hurled it onto the couch.
His reflection in the dark television screen looked smaller than he remembered. That afternoon, Ruth sat across from James at the small hotel desk, legal pad open, pen poised. She had slipped back into an old rhythm, one she hadn't realized she missed. If they acknowledge systemic failure, she said, they expose themselves to class action. James nodded, which they'll try to avoid.
They'll sacrifice individuals, Ruth continued. Call them bad actors. Isolate the incident. James looked at her. And you. She met his gaze steadily. I won't let them. She began outlining points, not emotional, not vindictive, precise, fair, the way she had always practiced law. Each line grounded in precedent, not anger. James watched her with a familiar ache of admiration and sorrow. This was the cost of being right, having to prove it. By evening, the first internal suspension email went out. A gate supervisor. Temporary, pending review. It was meant as a signal. It was not enough. Daniel called again. The board wants to speak with you. James glanced at Ruth. She was already nodding. The call was set for the following morning. Secure line, limited attendance. That night, neither of them slept much. Ruth lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the removal again and again, the moment the captain looked past her, as if she were furniture. James lay beside her, counting the seconds between waves, thinking of all the systems he had built, all the safeguards designed to prevent cascading failure. How rarely the flaw was technical. How often it was human. Morning came, with a pale sky and the hum of anticipation. The board call began promptly. Faces appeared, older, sharper, less forgiving than the executives James had dealt with over the years. These were people who measured loss in decades, not quarters. The chairman spoke first. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for joining us. James inclined his head. Of course. We are aware of your experience, the chairman continued, and your proximity to recent events. James did not correct the phrasing. Then you understand why I'm here. A murmur of assent. Ruth listened from just out of frame, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The board asked questions, not about feelings, about process, about governance, about why an airline would allow undocumented authority to override paid contracts. James answered calmly. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. He simply described what their own documents showed. By the end of the call, the air had shifted. We will be commissioning an external audit, the chairman said, effective immediately. James nodded. That's a start. And, the chairman added, we will be revisiting our relationship with certain customers. The implication was clear. When the call ended, Ruth let out a breath she'd been holding for days. They listened, she said. Yes, James replied. Because they had to. News of the audit leaked by afternoon. Not details, just the fact. Enough to unsettle. At headquarters, the CEO watched the ticker dip just slightly. Enough to sting. He picked up the phone again, this time dialing James's number directly. James let it ring. Outside, the tide was coming in, slow and relentless, smoothing the beach once more. The world looked calm, ordered. Inside the hotel room, Ruth closed her legal pad and set the pen down. This is the part where they try to regain control, she said. James smiled faintly. They never had it. The phone stopped ringing. James did not call back. Somewhere between the sound of the surf and the silence that followed, the shape of the ending grew clearer. Not dramatic, not explosive, but decisive. The airline's systems did not fail all at once. They began to hesitate. It started with a delay at a regional hub in Ohio, A routine boarding pause blamed on a software sync issue. 10 minutes became 20. Gate agents rebooted terminals. Pilots waited with engines idle, eyes flicking between darkening screens and watches ticking louder by the second. At headquarters, a junior engineer flagged the anomaly. Not an outage, a lag. Data packets queuing where they shouldn't. He sent a message upstream, careful with his wording. Intermittent performance degradation observed across payment and scheduling interfaces. By mid-morning, the hesitation had a rhythm. In Miami, a crew could not finalize a flight plan because weather data refused to populate. In Denver, baggage routing stalled, belts frozen mid-whir. In Newark, a payment terminal rejected a perfectly good card, then another, then another. Apologies multiplied, explanations thinned. James watched the alerts come in on his tablet while sitting at a small cafe near the beach, the kind with chipped mugs and a chalkboard menu. Ruth sat across from him, reading the paper, sunglasses low on her nose. To anyone passing, they looked like any other retired couple enjoying the morning. "Is that them?" she asked quietly, eyes still on the page. "Yes," James said. "The stress points are showing." He wasn't surprised. When systems were built to run lean, they had no patience for friction. A single constraint introduced at the wrong junction could ripple outward, not with drama, but with inevitability. He did not touch the screen. At headquarters, the CEO was already on his second call with operations. Voices overlapped, acronyms flew. Someone said bandwidth. Someone else said vendor throttling. "What does that mean?" the CEO snapped. "It means," the CTO said carefully, "that our primary provider appears to have deprioritized certain non-critical processes." "Non-critical," the CEO repeated, incredulous. "Payments are non-critical." "They shouldn't be," the CTO replied. "But the way our contract is structured..." The CEO cut him off. "Call them." "We did. And?" "They acknowledged receipt." The CEO felt a familiar sensation creeping in. Not panic. Recognition. The sense that a lever had been pulled somewhere he could not reach. Across town, Richard Coleman sat in his car outside a country club, staring at the gate that refused to open. He tapped his access card again. The red light blinked back at him, indifferent. He checked his phone. A voicemail from the airline. Another from a number he didn't recognize. He ignored both and drove away, jaw clenched, the world feeling subtly misaligned. At the cafe, Ruth folded her paper and leaned forward. "This is spreading." "Yes," James said, "but it's still reversible." She studied him. "You're giving them time." "I am," he said. Time reveals intent. At noon, the airline issued another statement, this one longer. Technical difficulties, out of an abundance of caution, working closely with partners. Markets reacted the way markets always did to uncertainty, slowly at first, then faster. By early afternoon, the board convened an emergency session. The CEO stood before them, tie loosened, voice strained but controlled. "This is a temporary disruption," he said. "We're coordinating with our vendor to restore full service." The chairman steepled his fingers. "Have they explained the cause?" "No," the CEO admitted. "But we believe," the chairman raised a hand. "Belief is not strategy." Silence followed. Heavy. Evaluative. In the background, an assistant slipped into the room and whispered something to the CEO. His face drained of color. "What?" the chairman asked. The CEO swallowed. "The vendor has formally invoked a compliance review clause." A murmur rippled around the table. "That clause requires what?" one director asked. "Independent audit. Immediate remediation. And," the CEO hesitated, "temporary limitation of services until findings are addressed." The chairman closed his eyes briefly. He knew that clause. He had signed off on it, buried deep in an agreement no one had expected to matter. "Who requested the review?" he asked. The CEO did not answer immediately. He didn't need to. At the cafe, James's tablet chimed again. A new alert. Vendor compliance protocol acknowledged. Ruth reached across the table and touched his hand. "They know now." "Yes. Are you ready?" He looked at her, at the lines around her eyes, earned and honest, at the steadiness she had carried through the worst of it. Yes. He made a call. Not to the airline, to an independent firm whose name never appeared in press releases, the kind that audited quietly and reported mercilessly. "Proceed," James said. "Full scope." The afternoon wore on. Delays stacked, flights cancelled, crews timed out. Passengers slept on terminal floors. News cameras arrived, lights harsh and unforgiving. The CEO stood in a private office, phone pressed to his ear, listening to a voice that was calm, distant, unyielding. "We are not shutting you down," the voice said. "We are holding you to the agreement you signed." "This will destroy us," the CEO said. "No," the voice replied. "Your choices did that." The line went dead. By evening, the airline grounded a significant portion of its fleet. Not all. Enough. The announcement hit the screens in the cafe. Ruth read it silently, then looked up. "People are stranded," she said. James nodded. "And they deserve better than what they got." She watched him closely. "This isn't revenge." "No," he said. "It's consequence." At the country club, Richard Coleman watched the news on a mounted television, drink untouched in his hand. The anchor spoke of systemic failures, of corporate culture under scrutiny. His name was not mentioned. Yet. He felt something hollow open in his chest. Night fell. The beach emptied. The tide crept in, erasing footprints, smoothing sand. In a glass tower miles away, the CEO sat alone, staring at a wall of screens showing aircraft icons blinking from green to amber to red. Each color a cost, each delay a question. He thought of the couple, the quiet refusal, the way the man had looked at him through the screen earlier that day, not angry, not triumphant, resolved. At the hotel, James and Ruth stood on the balcony again, listening to the surf. "You okay?" James asked. Ruth nodded slowly. "I am now." They stood together, the night air cool against their skin, as the consequences they had set in motion continued to unfold. Not with a crash, but with a reckoning. The grounding spread like a bruise, darkening from the center outward. By morning, the airline's departure boards told a story no press release could soften. Cancelled. Delayed. Pending review. The words repeated across terminals from the East Coast to the Midwest, blinking in patient, merciless rhythm. Passengers slept in chairs. Children cried. Gate agents apologized until their voices went hoarse. Somewhere between the third announcement and the fourth, people stopped believing reassurance altogether. At headquarters, the CEO sat in the operations center, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, eyes rimmed red. Every screen showed a different problem, and none of them had a clean solution. The audit firm's representatives had arrived before dawn, quiet, efficient, already pulling logs and access records with surgical precision. This was no longer about restoring service. It was about surviving the truth. The board reconvened mid-morning, this time without ceremony. The chairman did not waste time on pleasantries. "You made this worse," he said flatly. The CEO opened his mouth, then closed it. Excuses felt fragile now, almost obscene. "We trusted process," he said finally. "We trusted our people. You trusted convenience. the chairman replied. And you mistook compliance for character. Silence followed. Not shocked. Decided. Across the country, Ruth Whitaker stood at the hotel window, watching the news unfold on the muted television. She saw images of stranded passengers, the scrolling ticker of cancelled flights, the talking heads speculating about mismanagement and culture. She turned away, sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands rested on her knees, steady now. James was on the phone again, voice low, measured. He wasn't giving orders. He was answering questions. From regulators, from auditors, from people who had suddenly realized how exposed they were. Yes, he said. The limitations are contractual. No, they are not punitive. They are conditional. He ended the call and looked at Ruth. They're asking for a timeline. She nodded. They'll get one. He sat beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of it all pressed down, not triumphant, not cruel, just heavy. I keep thinking about that woman in the second row, Ruth said quietly. The one who spoke up. James nodded. Me too. She'll remember that moment for the rest of her life. Yes, and so will I. At the airline, Richard Coleman finally heard his name spoken aloud, and not kindly. It happened in a conference room with glass walls and no warmth. Two executives sat across from him, folders open, expressions controlled. We're reviewing all priority customer relationships, one of them said, including yours. Richard leaned back, forcing a smile. This is ridiculous. I've been loyal to this airline for years. That loyalty does not exempt you from scrutiny, the other replied. Richard felt the ground tilt. You're blaming me. We're examining influence, the executive said, and behavior. He stood abruptly. I did nothing wrong. Neither executive responded. Silence again. The kind that signaled the end of indulgence. By afternoon, his priority status was suspended pending review. The email arrived while he sat alone in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if motion might make things worse. At headquarters, the CEO watched the audit team work, their presence stripping away any illusion of control. They spoke little. They documented everything. Late in the day, the chairman requested a private conversation. The CEO followed him into a smaller room, door closing softly behind them. This company cannot recover under your leadership, the chairman said without preamble. The CEO swallowed. He had expected this, dreaded it, prepared speeches in his head that now felt useless. I can fix this, he said. You can't, the chairman replied. Because this isn't a technical failure. It's cultural. And you built it. The words landed with finality. Your resignation will be announced tomorrow morning, the chairman continued. You'll be given the courtesy of framing it as voluntary. The CEO nodded slowly. Relief and humiliation tangled in his chest. And the vendor? The chairman's eyes sharpened. We will deal with them honestly. For once. That evening, James received the call he had known was coming. He stepped onto the balcony to take it, the sound of the surf steady beneath the voice on the line. Mr. Whitaker, the chairman said, this is Harrison Lowell. We haven't met. I know who you are, James replied. I'm calling to acknowledge responsibility, Lowell said, not to negotiate. Not yet. To acknowledge. James listened. He did not interrupt. We failed, Lowell continued, and we're paying for it. Leadership changes are underway. External oversight has been initiated. We intend to cooperate fully. James closed his eyes briefly. Not in satisfaction. In resolve. Words matter, he said, but actions matter more. They're coming, Lowell said, whether we like them or not. The call ended. Ruth joined James on the balcony. The sky was streaked with late afternoon gold, the ocean catching fire beneath it. "It's happening," she said. "Yes." She studied his face. "Do you feel anything like victory?" James considered. "No." "Good." They stood together as the sun dipped lower, the light softening everything it touched. That night, the resignation broke. News alerts buzzed, analysts speculated, commentators dissected. The airline's stock dropped again, then steadied, the market absorbing the shock. In terminals across the country, passengers cheered when flights were rebooked, cursed when they weren't. The world moved, unevenly, forward. Richard Coleman sat alone at his kitchen table, laptop open, reading the email that stripped his status completely. No apology, no explanation, just a statement of change. He closed the laptop and stared at his hands. For the first time in years, no one was listening to him. At the hotel, Ruth packed their bags. Calm, methodical. "Ready to go home," she said. James nodded. "Yes." As they checked out the next morning, the clerk smiled warmly, thanked them, wished them a safe trip. No hesitation, no calculation. In the rental car, Ruth looked out at the road stretching ahead. "Do you think it will stick?" James merged into traffic, steady and sure. "It will leave a mark." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's enough." They drove north, leaving the beach behind, the sound of waves fading as miles accumulated. Behind them, an airline struggled to rebuild itself, stripped of illusions. Ahead of them, a quieter life waited, not unchanged, but affirmed. The house was quiet when they returned, the kind of quiet that felt earned. James unlocked the door and stood aside as Ruth stepped in first, setting her bag down by the familiar table near the window. Afternoon light slanted across the floor, catching dust motes in slow motion. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Ruth moved through the rooms slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a bookshelf, grounding herself in the ordinary. James watched her from the doorway, aware of how much of the last week still lived under her skin. The phone rang before they had finished unpacking. James answered without looking at the number. "We've confirmed the scope," Daniel said. His voice sounded steadier than it had days ago. "Full external oversight. The audit is expanding." James closed his eyes briefly. "And the airline? Interim leadership installed. They've agreed to suspend discretionary priority overrides entirely. No exceptions. Everything documented. Everything logged." James nodded. "Good. They're also drafting a public acknowledgement," Daniel continued. "Not an apology statement. An admission of failure." James leaned against the counter. "That matters." After the call ended, Ruth poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. James joined her. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. "I keep replaying it," Ruth said softly. "Not the removal, the moment before, when I thought they might listen." James folded his hands together. "And they didn't." "No," she said. "They chose the easier thing." James met her eyes. "That choice cost them." Ruth nodded. "But it also cost us." "Yes." She exhaled slowly. "I don't want to carry this forever." "You won't," he said. "But you won't forget it either." Later that evening, an email arrived from a law firm Ruth recognized instantly. She read it once, then again, her brow furrowing. "They're proposing mediation," she said. James looked up from his book. "Already?" "They want to settle potential civil exposure," Ruth continued. Quietly, generously. James set the book aside. "And They want us to sign a confidentiality agreement. James's mouth tightened. No. Ruth smiled faintly. I know. She typed a reply, fingers sure, efficient. No confidentiality, no silence. Cooperation only under transparent terms. She sent it and closed the laptop. That's the last time I practice law for free, she said, trying to lighten the air. James smiled, but his eyes stayed serious. You practiced it for yourself. That's not free. The next days unfolded in layers. Press coverage deepened. Former employees spoke anonymously about pressure, about being taught to avoid problems rather than solve them. Advocacy groups weighed in. Regulators announced reviews not just of one airline, but of industry practices more broadly. James watched it all with a careful distance. He responded when asked. He declined when not. He understood the difference between influence and control. One afternoon, Ruth received a handwritten letter. It came in a plain envelope, addressed carefully, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it slowly, reading in silence. It's from the woman on the plane, she said finally. James looked up. She says her name is Margaret. She says she's been thinking about that day every night since. She thanked us for not moving, for making it visible. Ruth swallowed. She says she didn't think it would matter if she spoke up, but she did anyway. James felt something loosen in his chest. It did matter. Ruth folded the letter carefully and set it aside. That's the part I didn't expect. What? That it would give someone else permission. A week later, James was invited to testify before a closed-door regulatory panel. Not as an accuser, as an expert. He sat at a long table under soft lights, explaining how systems reflected values, how unchecked discretion became bias, how accountability could be designed instead of enforced after the fact. He spoke plainly. No theatrics, no bitterness. When he finished, one of the panel members leaned forward. Why did you pursue this so far? James answered without hesitation. Because the cost of silence compounds. At home, Ruth watched the coverage that night, his face composed on the screen, his words clipped and careful. She felt pride, yes, but also something quieter. Relief. That night, they sat on the back porch, the air cool, the stars clear. I don't feel angry anymore, Ruth said. James nodded. Neither do I. I feel tired, she added. He smiled gently. That means it's ending. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you think they'll really change? James considered. Some will, some won't. But they'll think twice. Ruth closed her eyes. That's enough. The settlement offer returned, revised. This time, without a silence clause. It included funding for bias training, monitored by an independent body, compensation for affected passengers, and a public report on reforms. Ruth read it carefully, line by line. She looked at James. This is real. He nodded. Then we accept. The announcement came days later. Headlines shifted from collapse to reform, from outrage to analysis. The story became a case study, not a spectacle. Richard Coleman's name surfaced briefly in a footnote of an article about suspended loyalty programs. No scandal, no redemption, just absence. James and Ruth resumed their routines. Walks in the morning, dinner at the same table, life narrowing back down to what fit. One afternoon, as Ruth tended the garden, James watched her from the window, the sunlight catching her hair. He felt the deep, steady gratitude of having stood firm together. The world had moved, systems had shifted, but the greatest change had already happened, quietly, on an airplane, when they chose not to stand up and leave. They had stayed. And in staying, They had altered the shape of things to come. The invitation arrived on thick paper, understated and deliberate, the kind that assumed attention without demanding it. James read it twice before setting it on the kitchen counter. The seal at the bottom was embossed, subtle. A closed-door industry summit. Policy, accountability, future safeguards. Washington, D.C. Ruth dried her hands on a towel and picked it up. They want you on a stage. Yes, James said, but not to speak loudly. She smiled faintly. That's never been your problem. They traveled by train this time. No rushing terminals, no overhead bins. The steady rhythm of wheels on track gave James space to think. Outside the window, towns slid past, unremarkable and familiar. The geography of a life lived long enough to know where power actually resided. At the conference center, security was quiet but present. Attendees wore the uniform of seriousness. Dark suits, muted ties, sensible shoes. This was not a crowd that clapped easily. They measured applause like risk. James took his seat at a long table, Ruth beside him, name placards aligned with careful symmetry. Across from them sat executives, regulators, consultants, people who had spent careers solving problems after they had already done damage. The session began without flourish. A moderator spoke about lessons learned, about trust erosion, about restoring confidence. The language was careful, almost antiseptic. When James was invited to speak, he did not stand. He leaned forward instead, hands folded. I'm not here as a victim, he said, and I'm not here as a savior. I'm here because systems do what they're designed to do. He spoke of discretion without oversight, of incentives that rewarded speed over fairness, of how bias hid comfortably inside efficiency metrics. No one interrupted. Ruth watched the room as he spoke, noticing the shift. Some faces tightened, others softened. A few nodded, slowly, reluctantly. When he finished, there was no applause, just silence. Then pens moving, notes taken. During the break, a woman approached Ruth, mid-50s, silver hair, government badge clipped neatly at her waist. I wanted to thank you, the woman said, for insisting on transparency. Ruth met her gaze. It shouldn't require insistence. No, the woman agreed, but it often does. The summit ended without conclusions, but with commitments, working groups, timelines, oversight mechanisms, the machinery of reform grinding into motion. On the way home, Ruth leaned her head against the train window, watching dusk settle. You didn't shame them, she said. I wasn't trying to, James replied. Shame makes people defensive. She nodded. You gave them a mirror. Yes. Back home, life continued to reassemble itself. The garden needed weeding. The mail piled up. A neighbor stopped by with a casserole and vague words of support that carried more sincerity than polish. One afternoon, James received a call from an unfamiliar number. This is Harrison Lowell, the voice said, former chairman. James listened. I wanted you to hear it from me, Lowell continued. The airline has finalized its restructuring. Independent oversight is permanent. Leadership compensation is now tied to compliance metrics. James exhaled slowly. That's significant. It's necessary, Lowell said, and overdue. They ended the call with mutual restraint. No forgiveness, no hostility, just closure. That evening, Ruth found James in the study, staring at a framed photograph on the shelf. Younger versions of themselves. A different life stage. The optimism of beginnings. You're thinking about endings, she said. Beginnings, he corrected. They look similar, sometimes. She sat beside him. Do you regret it? He shook his head. No, even with the cost. Yes, he said. especially because of it. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines, replaced by new crises, new outrages. But its imprint remained. Training manuals revised, protocols rewritten, quiet changes that never made the news. Ruth received another letter, this one from a young man who worked at an airport in the Midwest. He wrote about speaking up for the first time, about refusing to move a passenger because of status, about feeling afraid and then proud. She read it aloud to James, her voice catching on the last line. "I didn't know I was allowed to say no." James closed his eyes. The words settled deep. That night they sat on the porch, the air heavy with summer. Cicadas hummed. Somewhere, a train horn sounded in the distance. "You know," Ruth said, "we never did take that trip." James smiled. "Florida can wait." She looked at him. "I wasn't talking about Florida." He reached for her hand, held it. "Where then?" She squeezed his fingers. "Anywhere we're treated like we belong." He nodded. "That's everywhere now." She laughed softly. Not bitter, not triumphant. Just tired and real. The next morning, James declined another speaking invitation. Then another. He chose instead to mentor quietly, to advise from the margins, to shape things without spectacle. Ruth returned to her volunteer work at the legal clinic, guiding others through systems she knew too well. She listened more than she spoke. She understood the value of being seen. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Ruth paused, knife hovering mid-air. "Do you remember the look on that man's face?" she said, "when he realized we weren't moving?" James nodded. "Yes." "That was the moment," she said. "Not when the airline faltered, not when the board shifted. That moment." James set down the pan and looked at her. "Because it was the first consequence." "Yes." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind built over decades. Later, as they washed dishes side by side, Ruth smiled to herself. "What?" James asked. She shook her head. "I was just thinking how small it started." James nodded. "It always does." Outside, the neighborhood settled into night. Porch lights clicked on. A dog barked, then quieted. Life, persistent and ordinary. And somewhere far away, in boardrooms and terminals and policy binders, a line had been redrawn. Not because someone demanded it, but because someone refused to step aside. The morning they finally flew again, the airport felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, just honest. James and Ruth arrived early, not out of anxiety, but habit, the kind built over decades of respecting systems, even when systems had not respected them back. The terminal lights hummed, coffee steamed, shoes squeaked against polished floors. Ordinary sounds, steady and grounding. They stood in line together, shoulders relaxed, no urgency between them. Ruth watched the people ahead, a young couple arguing softly about seat numbers, an older man fumbling with his phone, a gate agent patiently repeating the same instructions. Life unfolding without noticing them, and for once, that felt right. When their boarding passes were scanned, there was no pause, no second look, no recalculation behind someone's eyes. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker," the agent said with an easy smile. "Enjoy your flight." Ruth caught James's glance. A small nod passed between them. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation. They boarded with the first group, not because of status, but because that was what their tickets said. The jet bridge curved gently, the familiar metallic echo of footsteps sounding like memory. Ruth inhaled, slowly, deliberately, as the aircraft door came into view. Inside, the cabin smelled of clean fabric and recycled air. The first-class seats waited, wide and unremarkable, exactly as they should be. No tension clung to them now. No sense of territory to be defended. James stowed their bag. Ruth settled into the window seat. The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling pale gold across the tarmac. A flight attendant approached, not rushed, not strained, middle-aged, calm eyes. The kind of presence that came from confidence rather than performance. "Welcome aboard," she said. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Water would be perfect," Ruth replied. James smiled. "Same, thank you." The attendant nodded and moved on, already greeting the next passengers with the same tone, the same care. Ruth exhaled, long and quiet. That's all it ever needed to be. James rested his arm between the seats, his hand open. She placed hers there, fingers interlacing naturally. As boarding continued, James watched the cabin fill. Different faces, different ages, a cross-section of lives, none of them asking to be measured against another. The door closed with a solid, final sound. The plane pushed back from the gate. Ruth felt it then, the last thread of tension loosening in her chest. Not relief exactly, resolution. She leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. Images drifted through her mind. The gate, the office, the hotel room, the long nights of waiting, the quiet conversations that had changed more than headlines ever could. James watched her, the lines of her face softening as the plane began to taxi. He thought of the cost, yes, but also of the balance restored. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. The safety briefing played. The engines roared, rising in pitch. The plane gathered speed. As they lifted off, Ruth opened her eyes and looked out the window. The ground fell away, shrinking into patterns and shapes. Roads, cars, people going about their lives, unaware of how close things always were to shifting. James felt the familiar pressure in his chest, then the release. He had flown hundreds of times. This one felt different. Not triumphant. Complete. At cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its rhythm. The clink of ice, the rustle of newspapers, low conversation. Ordinary luxury, not stolen or contested, just present. Ruth accepted her water and took a slow sip. She turned to James. "You know," she said, "I don't think about him anymore." James nodded. "Neither do I." "What stays," she continued, "is the choice we made." "Yes," he said. "That's the part worth keeping." They talked quietly as the flight carried them forward. About their garden, about friends they hadn't seen in too long, about places they might go next, not as an escape, but as a continuation. Somewhere over the clouds, the story that had once felt so heavy began to feel lighter, not because it mattered less, but because it had found its place. When the plane began its descent, Ruth reached for James's hand again. He squeezed back, steady and sure. Whatever systems changed after them, whatever policies were rewritten or promises made, this moment belonged only to them. Two people who had stayed seated. Two people who had refused to disappear quietly. Two people who had reminded a system what consequence looked like. As the wheels touched down and the cabin filled with the sound of applause, Ruth smiled, not at the noise, but at the simple fact of arrival. Home was not just a place, it was being seen. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a moment when standing your ground mattered, take a second to like this story, subscribe for more like it, and leave a comment with your thoughts.